Much of what I've discussed on this channel relates to this phenomenon in American society and probably elsewhere as well, of how young people are so often forced to adjust to the harmful environments in which they find themselves. Environments that are painful, that are often abusive, and certainly are not good for our growth and development. And how the focus so often is not on addressing these real problems that young people face, but is instead on forcing the kid to adapt to these situations. It's about designating the kid or the teenager as the problem and then modifying them so that they are less annoying to whoever is in charge. And the adults convince themselves that they are helping the young person when they do this, but it's just the opposite. And I've talked a lot about how mental health professionals who work with children are a huge part of this pattern. So, for example, you might have psychiatrists who label a kid with ADHD because the school system doesn't work for them for any number of reasons. Or maybe they label the kid with anxiety because they're trapped in a family system in which they are being traumatized. Or you have psychotherapists acting as agents of parents in dysfunctional family systems, forcing the kid, again, to adapt to that system. And of course, there is a huge cost to treating young people this way. The cost could be their mental health, or as I would put it, their emotional and spiritual well being. The cost could be their disconnection from their true selves. Maybe they lose their connection to their purpose and what they want to do in this world. So I would say that treating young people this way is a huge loss, both for them and for our society. Now, there's another major way that children are forced to adapt to the harmful systems that they find themselves in that I haven't touched much on yet, and that is the troubled teen industry, or the TTI. The troubled teen industry is synonymous with, or at least overlaps with, the larger youth mental health treatment industry. And it includes things like therapeutic boarding schools, residential treatment centers, wilderness therapy, boot camps, youth addiction facilities, lockdowns, and much more. And I haven't discussed this yet, in part because it's so dark and atrocious. I mean, this larger dynamic of young people being broken down by their environment is also quite dark. But I think that the troubled teen industry is when this dynamic starts to get truly evil. My perspective on this topic comes largely from personal experience and observations. It also comes from talking with survivors and reading many accounts of it. It's not meant to be a totally comprehensive account of it, so I would highly recommend you listen to and read the works of other survivors. Something to keep in mind is I went to probably among the least abusive programs, and so I can't comment on some of the more egregious abuse in the industry. I went to a wilderness therapy program and then went to a therapeutic boarding school, and I was in the TTI for a total of about 2 years. So, what happens is these kids are taken against their will, literally by professional kidnappers, to these programs. And they operate in states that have fewer regulations to protect the human rights of young people, which allows this industry to operate. And that right there should tell you something about the true purpose of these programs. That perhaps it is more about authoritarian control of young people and human rights abuses than it is about actually helping them with their mental health, which is what these programs claim to be about. Often, the kids that are sent to these programs are the ones that keep fighting, the ones that don't merely comply and adjust to their environment, but maybe keep fighting for their real needs and their real perspective. If you think about a kid or a teenager on a continuum of compliance, let's say, you have the kids that really very easily and willingly just adjust to whatever environment they're in. and perhaps even become enthusiastic agents of the people that have the power in that system. Some resist a bit, maybe, and they might get drugged and psychiatrically labeled. And some just keep resisting and keep fighting. And I would say these are the ones that are likely to get sent to the troubled teen industry. Now, of course, this is not necessarily applicable to everybody that gets sent to these programs, but I think that this pattern is very real. Now, if the real purpose of these programs is to break us down and force us to be compliant, which is what I would argue, what does that actually look like within these programs? Well, I'm going to touch on a few key dynamics that I see here. The first one is that they exert total control over our lives. So we have been taken against our will from our homes, kidnapped, and brought to these places, which are essentially prisons, where we need to stay for exactly however long these people in charge say. And the parents no longer have that much power anymore because they are being manipulated by these clinicians. And so, literally, every single aspect of our life is controlled, including and especially our thoughts. And that happens through the constant therapy, which could just be individual therapy sessions. It could be the tons of group therapy in which we are attacked by our peers. It's in the constant check ins that we have in staff, where we are basically under constant scrutiny. Another way that our thoughts are controlled is that the clinicians read our journals. So, one of the first things that happened to me when I got there was they read my journal against my will. They didn't even announce it, they just took it and read it. And I think that that was a way of them sending a message of saying, you no longer have a private identity anymore. You no longer have personal sovereignty of any kind, including your own thoughts. Your thoughts are not yours anymore at all. And you really have to become exactly what we say in order for you to gain your freedom back. And when this happens and this starts to sink in, it's, a lot of depression can sink in. It's an incredibly painful experience that I think is can be really hard to wrap one's head around if we don't actually experience it directly ourselves. Also, all of our clothes and our personal possessions are taken away, which again is a way of stripping our identity from us completely and basically showing us that we no longer have any say over our own lives. And I think in general, children have too little say over their own lives. They don't get to make enough of their own choices. And often this, by the way, is why we are rebelling. But instead of actually seeing that situation for what it is and meeting those real needs there, as I see it, instead they go in the extreme wrong direction and take away everything from us, including our right to our own thoughts. Also, we had no contact with the outside world, including our parents. So most of these programs are on these little ranches way out in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles from civilization. And at the program that I went to, the only contact that we got with our parents was a once weekly phone call with them that was supervised with our therapist. And the message there was, even your relationship with your parents is now subject to the coercive authority of these clinicians. Now, obviously, experiencing something like this is horrible for somebody's mental health. You're taking an already very traumatized young person and you're piling on way more trauma. And this could absolutely make somebody suicidal. But of course, you're not in an environment where you can show anybody that or explore that or deal with that at all. And if you do show anybody that that's what's going on for you, then they will punish you and they will keep you there for longer and you won't be able to move forward in the program and move on with your life. Also, because of this total disconnection with the outside world, there's no way for us to report abuse that might be happening there. So if somebody, God forbid, is being physically or sexually abused, there's nothing that they can do. Another way that these programs break us down is by a constant and extreme focus on all aspects of our behavior. And it's important to understand the situation that this is embedded in. We've been taken against our will and held at this prison that they call a mental health facility. And our ability to gain our freedom back and move on with our lives is dependent on the whims and judgment of our jailers, who now are actually exerting a lot of control over our parents. And this is a key aspect of it, is how these people manipulate the parents, is they really stoke the parents' fears, and they say, if you don't do exactly what we say, your kid is probably going to end up dead or in jail. They often have the parents read these books that really get them freaked out. Books like Beautiful Boy and Tweak, about these kids that are, addicted to meth or whatever. And so they're really stoking the parents' fears in order to extract money from them. Often they are getting the parents to take out loans to send these kids there. And they're leading the parents to believe that they're actually helping the kids with their mental health, when obviously they're just piling on tons of trauma on these kids that are already quite vulnerable. So because of this situation that we're in, we get hyper focused on modifying ourselves according to the whims and judgment and really the dysfunction of, of our overlords in this situation. And so we lose that connection to who we really are, because if we are connected to who we really are, which by the way is probably going to be a huge source of our own mental health and our own real well-being, well, then we're going to get attacked and we're going to get in trouble because we aren't hyper focused on appeasing our jailers in this situation, which are these clinicians and these staff. Now, with this constant focus on our behavior, one thing that happened to me was and I think this is a very common experience, is I became very focused on anything that could be wrong with me. So I basically bought into these people's narrative, because I really didn't have a choice, that if my behavior didn't line up exactly with what they expected, then there was something wrong with me. And so we get constantly worried about what could be wrong with us, um, which is interesting when you think about the fact that most of these kids at these programs are coming from toxic and dysfunctional family systems, where it really might be better to depathologize ourselves and instead focus on and start to observe what could be wrong with the people around us. Because I think that is a huge part of healing from being programmed in dysfunctional family systems. Well, these programs do exactly the opposite. They take us in the opposite direction. So it's really like taking a victim and turning them against themselves. That's really what these programs are doing, or at least that's part of what they're doing. Another way these programs break us down, which I've already touched on, is the total surveillance. Absolutely everything we do is subject to the scrutiny and the evaluation of these people, and we have no ability to resist or push back. They have the ability to tell our parents that we are unwell and that we need to stay there longer. They can punish us and make our miserable lives more miserable. And because of this, there is a tremendous atmosphere of fear. And the staff will target or terrorize one student as a way of sending a message to all the others and creating this kind of pervasive atmosphere of fear. And so there are arbitrary punishments that make no sense. There's public humiliation. You could be forced to confess to things that you never did. There is cruel and unusual punishment, like shoveling animal feces was a common thing that occurred at my program. And also gaslighting was another major way that we were systematically broken down in this environment. So if you think about some of the dynamics that I've described and the way that can cause huge amounts of trauma, huge mental health issues like complex PTSD and hypervigilance. Well, my experience was that the therapists would basically gaslight us into thinking that these things were just inherently something wrong with us. So, of course, rather than allowing us to see the true sources of this trauma, we were basically brainwashed into thinking that it was just something inherently wrong with us, some kind of a genetic defect. And they would do this with the trauma that we were coming in with as well. So the parents don't want to own the fact that we have all of this trauma uh, from our family system. They want to believe that it's just some inherent brain defect that we have. And then they are essentially hiring these programs to brainwash us into that totally bullshit narrative. And this was something that happened to me at both of the programs that I went to, and was part of my relationship with all of the therapists that I experienced directly at these programs. Now, in my experience, one major aspect of the gaslighting that took place at these programs has to do with the fact that these are actually real clinicians. Not at all the programs in the troubled teen industry, but at the ones that I went to. These are actual clinicians with licenses, with PhDs, with years of experience, often with experience at prestigious institutions. So these are very well credentialed people. And this makes it so much harder to see that these people are really just abusers of some of the most vulnerable people in our society who are financially exploiting and manipulating desperate parents. And so it's really hard not to buy into their narrative that they are these wonderful, skilled, sophisticated clinicians. And another aspect of how these programs would systematically break us down was with this very weird obsession with punishment. So there was social isolation as punishment, all kinds of forced labor, forcing us to shovel animal feces for hours on end, sleep deprivation, strip searches, and more. Now, needless to say, I think it's pretty clear that the people working at these programs are pretty sick people. Probably horrible things happened to them when they were kids. And so they're unable to perceive there being anything wrong with torturing these kids the way that they do, with tearing families apart, with manipulating and financially exploiting desperate parents. Healthy people would have a conscience that stops them from doing these things. So overall here, you have this really twisted situation where you have these parents who don't want to or don't know how to take responsibility for the situation and really be introspective. And so they are sent to these abusive programs where they are forced to be compliant and just adjust to this dysfunctional family system the way that it is, even though it's traumatizing and damaging. Where at these programs, they are stigmatized and a ton more trauma is just piled right on them. And you have these programs telling these parents how wonderful they are, what amazing parents they are, how screwed up and horrible the kid is, how amazing they are for giving these kids this incredible opportunity to heal, and how if they just give them more money, then they'll be able to fix their kid for them. And so you have this situation in the troubled teen industry where you have these extremely troubled adults who are feeding off of each other's dysfunction and playing into it and are scapegoating these kids and basically torturing them at these programs. Now, why is the troubled teen industry significant? Well, for one, it's this massive human rights violation that has been taking place in the United States right under our noses and has affected probably most communities to some degree. But for me, the main reason it's significant is because this is where extreme authoritarian control of young people leads. If teenagers insist on being treated as fully human, eventually they can get sent to what is essentially a concentration camp for young people. And then when they are reeling from the trauma of it afterwards, the adults around them might just attribute this to some inherent defect that they have, because these adults have given them this wonderful opportunity. They've given them the best treatment that there is out there because this is the narrative that they've bought into. And so if they have all of these issues or if they're not achieving their potential in some way, then it must just be something inherently wrong with them. So getting out of these programs, we've just had this horribly traumatic experience where a bunch of trauma has been piled on us after already having had a bunch of childhood trauma that we came in with that was never dealt with. Meanwhile, the people closest to us are deluded into thinking that we've just had this wonderful therapeutic experience because that is the kind of lie that they've been fed by these abusive clinicians. The last thing that I want to talk about here, which I've touched on before, is the value that these kids have. So these kids are just incredibly devalued and they're stigmatized and they're really abused. Um, and in all of that, even just experiencing it, I think that it's really easy to devalue ourselves and lose sight of our own value. But if you think about why these kids are not fitting into their environment, like, for example, their family system, maybe their family system is very repressed. Maybe there's a lot of trauma. Maybe it's very authoritarian. And they're not fitting into that system because it doesn't work for them. Maybe they're too aware. Maybe they see the truth about it and they are really vocal about that truth. And they're really kind of insistent on a healthier, better way. And they're kind of like change agents in that system. And even though this is a really positive thing and a really cool thing, it's simply not tolerated. And so rather than this situation being seen for what it is, these kids being validated and really having some allies on their side, instead, these programs, and I would say many other mental health professionals that deal with children in our society, break these children down, they shame them, they bolster this narrative that these kids are genetically defective, or maybe they have character defects like they're immature or whatever. And at these programs, they're incarcerated, they're tortured, and they're really thrown under the bus. Or if you think about in the school system, when you have these behavior problem kids, often these kids are more creative. They have a greater connection to their interests and their curiosity, and they have a lot of drive behind that. Well, these are very, very positive things, very, very valuable things, both for the individual and for society. But they don't really fit in our school system. And they are really treated often as a nuisance in our school system. And what happens? Well, these mental health professionals come along and they, again, further this narrative that there's inherently something wrong with the kid, rather than really fighting for them and really helping to meet their actual needs. So we have kind of bought into this narrative that what looks like helping these kids is really forcing them into these tiny little boxes that are very anti-creative and anti-life. So that's my general take on the real purpose of the troubled teen industry. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you know of anybody that you think might enjoy it or might be relevant for, please consider sharing it with them. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching to the end, and I look forward to having you for the next one.